Hey, how's it going, guys? This is Nick over at Old Anvil Speed Shop, and today we have Rob's 48 Chevrolet pickup truck in for a complete fuel system install. The products were provided by Aeromotive, and those components include a Phantom in-tank fuel sender. Then we're going to go ahead and install our Aeromotive inline fuel filter, and that's going to feed fuel all the way up to our Aeromotive SS series regulator that we have mounted under the firewall. And so in this video, we're going to cover the installation of the sender, installation of AN fittings and lines, proper mounting for your fuel pressure regulator, and along the way we're going to be using AN style hose and fittings to connect the dots from our pump, filter, and regulator. While we're making up those hoses, we're going to give you guys some tips and tricks on how to properly install AN fitting onto AN hose, and some do's and don'ts when routing your line, what to stay away from, what to shy away from, and what is the proper way for best hose life and longevity. So stay tuned and let's go ahead and get started on this thing. Today we're going to be installing a Aeromotive Phantom in-tank fuel system on Rob's 48 Chevrolet pickup truck. If you want to come in closer and take a look at what we got here, this is what's included in the kit. You have your sock, which keeps the fuel around the fuel sender itself. The fuel sender, here's your inlet, here's your return connection for the fuel pump. If you go over here, this is the mounting ring that goes inside the tank. That fastens this to the actual tank itself. Here's your fuel pump, a little inline filter sock, and then miscellaneous wiring fittings and nuts and bolts that are needed to do the install. So let's go ahead and make our way over there and let's get this installed in this truck. So the first step in this install is we got to drill a 3 1/4 inch hole into this fuel tank to accept the new sender and obviously pick up fuel instead of to the engine, right? This tank is all beautifully pinstriped, so we're not going to mess with any of this. The best spot we're going to choose is going to be this bottom right corner. It's all clear on the inside, no baffles, no foam. So I'm going to go ahead and put this hole in there. Then we are going to use this ring as a template to go ahead and drill our holes that actually fasten the sender itself to the fuel tank. So let's get started. After you get your 3 1/4 inch hole set up for the center of the sender, the next step is going to be drilling your perimeter bolts. This is going to allow this piece to go into the tank itself. There's a little provision here so you could actually fit it through and up. And these are what's going to mount the sender itself to the tank. It gets sandwiched in here with a really big foam gasket so that it'll give you like no leaks, and obviously it'll be a sealed system. So let's go ahead and get these holes drilled so we can move on to the next step. I'm going to get a quick bolt.
Strategy for metal shavings after the fact?
Each guy takes a turn and we all just pee in the tank, and then we take the cap out and we just let it all come out. One obvious thing is we have a tank full of metal shavings. There's many ways to go about flushing this out. Some people will remove the tank, put a garden hose, flush it all out. A method that I like to use is we have a little bit of probably a gallon or so of this old gas, or not old, just dirty gas. We'll put it in there. I'll make sure I slosh it around. There's a drain below the bottom of the tank, so it should all come out. I'll do that 2 or 3 times, filter the fuel every single time, and then take a visual inspection, and there should be no shavings in there. Once that's all done, we're clear to proceed on to the next step. Now that we have all our holes drilled in our fuel tank, the next thing is to determine the depth of it so we could trim our sock for our fuel sender. Yeah, all right. So this tank has a depth of 10 inches, and according to the instructions from Aeromotive, you want to add 1 inch of this. So that being 10, we want it from the bottom of here to somewhere over here at 11 inches. You give it a mark, you trim it out, then from here we could go on to assembling our actual fuel sender itself, mounting the fuel pump to the sender, clamping the lines, getting it all ready to be installed in the vehicle.
Left me on the bread line.
With that trimmed out, you go ahead and reinstall it back onto its sock. Make sure it's seated all nice and flat. Perfect. All right, now that we have our holes drilled, the next step is to install this ring. It has a little provision here so you can actually get it through the tank. And you be very careful not to drop it. And you line it up with the holes. So once you got this guide ring installed, you're gonna go ahead and shove this in the tank. Remember, we added 1 more inch per Aeromotive instructions, so it'll be a nice tight fit up against that lock ring. Now with the sock installed, I'm gonna verify my tank depth measurement because the next thing we're gonna do is attach the fuel pump to the sender itself. That measurement's kind of important so your fuel pickup always remains in fuel till you get to like a 1/4, 1/8 of a tank. So let's go ahead and measure this now. And again, it's still 10 inches, so we'll go ahead and go to the bench, assemble everything, and then drop it in the tank and we'll be done. There I go. So here's the fuel pump used on this Aeromotive system. It has 2 caps you need to remove in order to install it. Pop that one off. Here's the little pickup sock. It has a little lock ring that keeps it in place and 1 little clip that needs to be mounted over this stud to secure it in place. And it just clicks right on. Spoke too soon. Like that. You see that it's properly engaged in this clip so you know it's not going to be going anywhere. All right, so now that we have the sock mounted onto the fuel pump, the next thing to figure out is our tank depth. We measured it last and it was 10 inches, so we're gonna go ahead and come over here, 10 inches, right there. And then the next thing we need to do is trim out our pickup tube. You always wanna leave extra past this nipple to heat it up and slide it on, which we're gonna do next. Actually, no, we're not gonna do that next. Before we trim out this tube, the next thing we need to do is cut this bracket because obviously it hangs past 10. You wanna get it right about here, so you have enough room for your 2 mounting clamps to mount the pump to this piece right here. So let's go ahead and go to the bandsaw and trim this out. Then we'll trim this tube out, fasten them together, then it'll pretty much be ready to go into our fuel tank. I'm just kidding. All right, so next thing we need to do is trim up this pickup tube to get us our 10 inches of tank depth. I made a little mark there with the Sharpie. You just go ahead and bam. So next thing you need to do is heat this tube up. It expands when you heat it up and then it hardens up when it cools down. So you want to heat it up, shove it on there, hold it for a few seconds, make sure it's a good tight fit, and then you're going to put a small little hose clamp on it when all said and done. After that, we're going to fasten the pump to this piece right here and then we're pretty much good to go. Just like that. And once it's on there, you take this little clamp and you go ahead and make this up, and we're gonna fasten just like that to this piece. All right, now that we have our clamps made up on both the pickup and on the tank itself, there's 1 connection that needs to be made. You just plug them together, and now this is ready to be installed in the fuel tank and wrap this install up. All right, now this is ready to be installed in the tank. Our first step is gonna be installing our gasket over the studs, and then very carefully installing this into the sender itself, or into the tank itself. Line up all the holes, get it sitting flush. And then lastly, to fasten this down in the tank, you're gonna go ahead and take these clear washers. Usually the studs don't stick out enough off the jump. So what I do is I'll put 2 nuts on there and I'll make them up just to press this gasket down. And then grab our little individual washers and flip them over each stud. So with these two tightened, it again compresses the gasket to allow you to get the washer on there and the nut. And once you get all the nuts and washers started, go ahead and remove the nuts off those two studs that we didn't put washers on. And then go ahead and install your final two washers and put those nuts back on. And then you're gonna wanna torque these down in a nice sequence pattern so it sucks down nice and even to create a good seal. So this concludes our install of our Aeromotive Phantom in-tank fuel sender. The next steps of these videos is going to be us running fuel lines and mounting our fuel pressure regulator up under the engine bay. But as of right now, this is installed, ready to go to get wired and plumbed, and that's a wrap. All right, so now that we have our new Aeromotive fuel sender installed in our fuel tank, the next thing we're going to be doing is plumbing this thing up to the front. This vehicle has a small block Chevy with a Edelbrock series carburetor up top. So in most carburetor applications, what's going to be needed is a returnless style or a deadhead style fuel system. So pretty much that means there's no return line. It's just feeding fuel up there, and it stops at a regulator, and then it gives a regulated amount of fuel up to the carburetor, right? So now let's go ahead and get our system ready. We're going to put in a few fittings on our beginning and ends. We're going to lay out our fuel filter location, our regulator location, and then connect the dots with some dash 6 AN line. So let's get started. All right, so now that we have our first AN fitting made up onto our line, now we're going to go ahead and route it on the inside of the frame all the way to the front. Some key notes to take while running your fuel line is you want to be away from any heat source, such as like your exhaust, right? And you want to be away from any moving parts. You don't want your line to get pinched, cut, snagged, and of course any sharp edges. And you always want to run your bends with a nice big sweep. You don't want to kink your line or run too tight of a bend, or else you get into fuel delivery issues, cracking down the road once the line weathers out a little bit. So big sweeping turns away from any abrasives, any sharp edges, and any heat sources, and you should be home free. Okay, so there are a few methods to cutting your AN line. If it's not in the vehicle, our preferred method is taking it out, running a tape line, and running it through our bandsaw. It gives you a nice, clean, straight cut with minimal cleanup. And then if it's usually on a vehicle, we'll go ahead and cut it with a cutoff wheel, and then we'll go ahead and flush the line out as best we can. Usually if it's down like this, you could just run some carb cleaner or anything, any sort of cleaner to get it out, run it out and blow air out the other side. But yeah, those two methods. Avoid using any sort of cutters, because what ends up happening is you squeeze this line. There is a steel braided outside sheet on this, so if you crush that, you're going to end up having like an oval cut, and you're going to have a really hard time getting the nut on there and overall fitting assembly. So nice, clean, straight cut, abrasive or with the saw, good cleanup, good prep, makes for an easy fitting installation. All right, so after you got your nice clean cut, the first step in installing an AN fitting is getting this tube nut on there. It's nice to put them on with the jacket not flared out. That's why we use an abrasive or the saw to get a clean cut. When you do an abrasive, it kind of melts that outer layer, so you're not fighting any fraying. Next step is installing the actual fitting itself. A little tip I always put some anti-seize on the threads just to help it with going in and not gulling up these threads. And a little tiny bit of some sort of assembly lubricant or dish soap. You kind of want something that you don't want to overdo it, so just do a really, really light coat and then work the fitting in there. When you get started, if you're having trouble getting the first few threads on, you know you got a problem. You may need to go back in and clean the inside of your hose. Usually you can get them started very, very easily and throw them on. You can make them up pretty easily by hand. Once you get about halfway, 3/4, you're going to put some wrenches on there. And just make them up. You don't need to kill this. Just make them up nice and tight. You want this gap to be as minimum as possible. with like a maximum of like a 16th or an 1/8 inch gap. That's when you know you got full engagement and a leak-proof seal. So let's go ahead and do that now. Ideal situation would be removing this hose from the vehicle and putting the fitting in a vise with some soft jaws and using an aluminum AN wrench. But on the vehicle, you kind of work with what makes it easy. Just 2 3/4 inch wrenches, and just be very mindful on wrench placement on the fitting so they don't slip. That'll mess up the anodizing on the fitting. And just take your time, and if this thing starts binding up, just go ahead and remove the fitting again. Verify that everything is proper. Give it another shot, add a little bit more lube, and it should go together very, very easily. All right, so here we go. This is your ideal situation of assembling a AN fitting. It's gonna be on the bench with a nice pair of soft jaws. So let's go ahead and do this now. Again, we got a nice clean cut. The inside's been cleaned out. So first thing you're gonna do is run your tube nut onto the hose itself. It could be a little bit of a pain trying to do by hand. So my little tip or trick here is to get it started and then just go ahead and run it on with the impact. Depending on the manufacturer of fitting you have, some of them on the inside, I don't know if you want to get in there, they have just these 2 lips you got to go past, and you want them pretty much flush with the bottom of these threads. Other manufacturers, they have reverse threads in there, so you almost need to thread this onto the actual hose. So these you just push on, but again, just to make it a little bit easier, I go ahead and put them on an impact and just spin them on at a very, very slow speed. And just like that, you can see here, oopsies. We got proper hose depth into the fitting, nice clean square cut. The hose is centered in the nut, so now let's go ahead and install our fitting section. And then again, going back to those few things I mentioned earlier, running aluminum into aluminum, so you always want to put a little tiny bit of anti-seize. Don't overdo it. A little goes a long way with this stuff. I always smear it, because why not? And then some super small drop of assembly lube on the side, because this is going to actually run into the hose, so a little bit of lubrication always goes a long way. Can't say that with a straight face. And how I mentioned earlier, you should be able to get a very, very easy start to assembling these fittings. There should be no push, no struggle, no fight to get these on. If that's the case, there's something wrong there and you need to visit our previous steps. As you can see, I got it about a little over halfway, 3/4 on. That's how you know you got it pretty much perfect. And then the rest of it gets made up with a open wrench. Again, a preferred method may be to use a aluminum style AN wrench, but a little bit longer wrench, it does make it a little bit easier. And I've noticed that sometimes with aluminum wrenches, they may slip. If you just take your time with a proper size standard wrench, you should have no problems with gulling or scratching the AN finish on these fittings. Usually I do this much faster, but I want it to be theatrical. And there you have it. Okay, so now we just plug this right in the carburetor. We have all this line to keep the fuel cool when we're running. All right, so now we got our line all the way up to the engine bay. So now what we need to do is remove this old soft line, get it out of the way, change this fitting that goes into the carburetor. From the factory, these accept like a, I believe this is a 5/16 hose with like a push lock and a hose clamp style. We're gonna go ahead and remove that and put in a AN adapter. We're gonna mount our fuel pressure regulator nicely here on the firewall and then run our line to it and then regulator over the carburetor, and that wraps up the plumbing side of this vehicle. So let's go ahead and get it done. All right, so here we go. We have our Aeromotive SS series regulator. Again, this is a returnless style. You have your in and 2 outs. How this carburetor only has 1 inlet and we're not running a dual carb setup, we went ahead and put a plug on one side and we have our outlet here. Fuel's gonna come in. This is gonna go ahead and regulate the pressure coming from the pump. For a carburetor, you want as low as 3 PSI up to 7 PSI. Edelbrock, I believe, recommends a 5 to 7. So once we get this mounted, we'll go ahead and remove this plug, throw a gauge on there, and adjust our fuel pressure accordingly. So after much thought, we figured out that mounting the regulator right here in the firewall would be best. So we have a clean sweep from the line coming up and a clean run from the line going out to the carburetor. And it gives us a nice clear view of our gauge after we install that. And yeah, So we're gonna go ahead and mount this up in the firewall, and then we have 3 more fittings to make up, and then that wraps up this install. So on this last hose from the regulator to the carburetor, we went ahead and went with a -6 straight off the regulator and a -6 90 off the carb. So now I'm just mapping out the length to get a nice clean approach to both fittings. And we're gonna go ahead and run something just like this. This should do. Maybe we clock this back a little bit to get a little bit of a smoother approach. And that actually looks a little bit neater. So we'll go ahead and cut this, make these 2 fittings up, and call it a day. All right, so now we have our final line from the regulator to the carburetor finished up, tightened, all assembled, everything. So with all these components being installed, the fuel sender, the fuel filter, fuel pressure regulator, and the lines, this completes our fuel system install. And after this, once the vehicle is running, we're gonna go ahead and adjust our fuel pressure to provide sufficient fuel to the carburetor. And that pretty much wraps this thing up. So hope you guys enjoyed the video, and we'll catch you in the next one.